Hi, and welcome to this webinar on the Education Research and Development Centers competition. That's 84.305C, and that is funded through the National Center for Education Research. Just to give you a brief overview of the organizational structure of IES, there are 4 centers housed under the Office of the Director. And the 2 research grant centers are the National Center for Education Research and the National Center for Special Education Research. These are the 2 centers that are primarily responsible for funding grants in education research. You'll also notice the Standards and Review Office, which is connected to the Office of the Director. This is the office that is responsible for organizing the review of the grant applications that come into the 2 research centers. The 2 research centers have similar but slightly different missions. The mission of the National Center for Education Research, or NCER, is to support rigorous research that addresses the nation's most pressing education needs from early childhood to adult education. And the mission for the National Center for Special Education Research, or NCSER, is to sponsor research on special education that's designed to expand the knowledge and understanding of infants, toddlers, and students with or at risk for disabilities from birth through high school. Through their various grant programs, IES and the 2 centers support research on the development or identification of education interventions. And by interventions, we mean practices, programs, policies, and approaches. These interventions should enhance academic achievement and can be widely deployed. Also, another research objective for the 2 centers is to identify what does not work in education and thereby encourage innovation and further research, and to understand the processes that underlie the effectiveness of education interventions and the variation in their effectiveness. So in other words, what works, what doesn't work, and for whom it works, and in what contexts. The 2 research centers support a number of different research grant competitions, but in this webinar we will be discussing just one, the Research and Development Centers program, which is being funded through the National Center for Education Research this year in FY 2018. The National Research and Development Centers are responsible for contributing to the solution of a specific education problem and to the generation of new knowledge and theories relevant to the focus of the center. Centers are also responsible for conducting relatively rapid research and scholarship on supplemental questions that emerge within the center's topic area, and providing national leadership within the center's topic through disseminating research and engaging in dialogue with researchers, practitioners, and policymakers. They achieve these goals, as I said, through research, development, evaluation, national leadership, and dissemination. Each research and development center is responsible for a number of activities, the first of which is the focused program of research. This is how the center contributes to the solution of a specific education problem and generates new knowledge and theories. In your application, you must allocate at least 75% of your total budget to the focused program of research. Each research and development center will also be responsible for supplemental activities, which are typically, but not always, meetings and smaller scale studies. The center will work cooperatively with IES to select and design the supplemental activities after an award has been made. In your application, you do not need to provide a detailed plan. As I said, the specific activities will be developed after the center begins. You should show that you have the capacity for conducting the supplemental activities in your research narrative, and you must set aside at least 5% of your total budget for the supplemental activities. Finally, each research and development center will be responsible for engaging in leadership and dissemination activities. These include engaging with researchers, practitioners, and policymakers. You should have a website with reports and papers. The Institute encourages you to use innovative technology such as webinars and podcasts, or something even more innovative in your leadership and dissemination activities. Your manuscripts should be published through ERIC, the Education Resources Information Center. And you need to make your final research data available for others' use. In your application, under this section, you should describe the audiences and activities which you will engage in, and you should show capacity for leadership and outreach. Your proposal narrative includes 5 sections, and the center narrative is really the heart of your application, where you set out your plan for research and the justification for it. The peer reviewers tend to focus their attention on the center narrative, and it is recommended that your center narrative be no more than 35 pages. The first 2 sections of your narrative, the significance and the research plan, are specific to the individual center, and so will vary by topic. Each of those sections will be covered in more depth in the specific sections on the specific topics that follow this introductory section. In the leadership and outreach activities section, you should again discuss the audiences you intend to reach and the researchers and practitioners you intend to work with or to obtain input from. In the 4th section, the management and institutional resources section, make sure that you discuss the organizational structure of your center and the management plan for how it will run, and the resources available to conduct the work of the center. Personnel may vary slightly by center, and so we will discuss that on each of the topics that follow, but in general, you should think about who will carry out which part of the proposed work, what expertise and experience each of those people have to do this type of work, and how much time they have committed to the project. This year, the National Center for Education Research will be competing 4 research and development centers. The first is the Improving Education Outcomes for Disadvantaged Students in Choice Schools Center. That has a maximum grant duration of 5 years and $10 million. The Improving Rural Education Center has a maximum duration of 5 years and a maximum award of $10 million. The Writing in Secondary Schools Center has a maximum of 5 years and $5 million. And the Exploring Science Teaching in Elementary School Classrooms Center has a maximum duration of 5 years and a maximum award of $5 million. These maximums are true maximums if you request a duration greater than 5 years or an award amount greater than that listed on this slide and in the request for applications. Your application will not be reviewed. It will be deemed non-responsive. So it's very important that you abide by these maximums. Keep in mind that this webinar is not a substitute for reading the request for applications, so you should definitely go to our website, ies.ed.gov/funding, and make sure that you read the RFA for 305C so that you can get more detailed information about everything we discussed today. So now we will discuss each of these 4 centers in greater detail.
Greetings, my name is Wei Chow, and I am the IES Program Officer overseeing the Research and Development Center on Exploring Science Teaching in Elementary Classrooms. I'm going to provide a brief overview of this center, and then I will walk through the application requirements and recommendations around applications to this funding opportunity. If you're thinking about submitting to this competition, please be sure to read the RFA carefully and contact me so we can get into a bit more detail about how your proposal ideas might fit with this funding opportunity. So the Institute seeks to support a research and development center to delve deeply into science teaching in the early elementary school grades, specifically 1st through 3rd grade. The purpose of this center is to uncover the teaching actions that are associated with improved education outcomes for students, with a special focus on students from low-income families and underrepresented groups. So what do we mean by teaching actions? On page 45 of the RFA, we define teaching action as something a teacher does during lessons that is observable and specific. Teaching actions encompass the behaviors teachers engage in when presenting concepts of science, explaining science practices, and implementing course content from curriculum materials. For example, teaching actions could include the kind, frequency, and duration of talk used by teachers, body language and physical movement through space, components of feedback to students, and other specific behaviors instantiating the knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics necessary for teaching. What do we mean by underrepresented groups? Here, underrepresented refers to groups who are not enrolled in science courses or employed in science professions at levels expected given their numbers in the population. For example, African American and Hispanic Latino students are considered underrepresented in science because they constitute smaller percentages of science degree recipients and employed scientists and engineers than they do of the population. Recent work suggests that early science achievement gaps, meaning before third grade, have been observed between African American and Hispanic Latino students and white students. So why focus on the teaching of science rather than teaching of other content areas? Why early elementary science grades? Early elementary science teaching is an area of urgent need for rigorous research in light of new science standards, for instance, the next generation science standards, and findings that many elementary school teachers lack the training, background, and self-efficacy to teach science. As with the teaching of other content areas, science teaching theoretically requires adequate content knowledge, pedagogical content knowledge, and expertise to address a diverse range of student learning needs, over and above adequate curriculum materials. However, translating these broad categories into specific teaching actions remains a substantial challenge for teacher training and professional development. The Institute seeks to fund a research development center that will integrate literature and methods from multiple disciplines, including those not often used in research on teaching, such as industrial organizational psychology and cognitive science, to help advance teaching theory and practice. The Institute hopes to generate new insights through researchers who bring different theoretical perspectives and methodological approaches to the study of early elementary science instruction and who are examining teaching of similar content in various contexts. The Science Teaching Center will conduct in-depth exploratory research in schools and districts where there is an emphasis on early elementary science education and a commitment to closing achievement gaps between different income, racial, ethnic, and linguistic groups. The ultimate objective of the Science Teaching Center is to build a more comprehensive understanding of the specific science teaching actions related to improved learning and reduced student achievement gaps. This understanding may in turn lead to more refined theoretical constructs of teaching and better understanding of how it affects student outcomes. We also hope this understanding may lead to stronger measures of science teaching for use in research, practice improvement, and high-stakes decision-making, as well as more actionable guidance, training, and supports for educators and teacher educators. The center will conduct 3 complementary prospective studies, specifically an observation study, a measurement study, and a longitudinal study. The observational study will describe specific teaching actions, student responses to these actions during these lessons, and the correlations between these actions and student outcomes. Researchers may use a range of methods to identify the universe of specific science teaching actions that could affect student outcomes. The measurement study will develop reliable and valid measures to capture the teaching actions in the observation study. Researchers will develop valid and reliable measures to assess teaching actions during early elementary science instruction and for research conducted in this project. The longitudinal study will follow at least one cohort of students over multiple school years to explore the relations between the specific observable teaching actions and student outcomes. The goal of the longitudinal study is to determine whether there is an association between exposure to observable teaching actions and student education outcomes over a multi-year period. Now, I want to make a note here about studying interventions. the Institute anticipates that the research performed by the Science Teaching Center will lead to other projects, such as applying the findings about teaching actions to research on teacher training and supports. For this competition, however, the Institute does not intend to support the development of new interventions or the evaluation of fully developed interventions. Applicants interested in pursuing funding for intervention development, efficacy, or effectiveness studies should apply for funding under other IES funding opportunities, such as the Education Research Grants Program. For this competition, the grant will not support intervention activities. That includes the development, implementation, or evaluation of interventions. However, your research could include settings where interventions are taking place with the intent to capture the universe of teaching actions that could associate with improved student outcomes. Applications to the Science Teaching Center competition must meet the content area, sample, measures, and setting requirements in order to be responsive and sent forward to scientific peer review. In terms of content area, you must focus on science teaching, including physical, earth, and/or life sciences. You may also focus on additional content areas that may be related to science teaching, such as reading or math. In terms of sample, you must focus on typically developing students in the early elementary school grades, that is, first, second, and/or third grade, and their teachers providing science instruction. A majority of the sample should be low income and/or from and underrepresented groups. Students with or at risk for disabilities may be included in your proposed research activities, but must not be the primary focus. Since the center is focused on uncovering teaching actions, you must include measures of teaching theorized to influence student outcomes. In addition to science teaching actions, stronger applications will include teaching constructs established in the empirical literature to predict student outcomes, such as classroom management and organization and teacher science content knowledge. As with any IES funding opportunity, all studies must include measures of students. These measures must include knowledge of science concepts and practices, and other factors associated with persistence in science. In terms of setting requirements, as with other IES funding opportunities, the research must be conducted in authentic education settings. External providers, such as museums, science centers, environmental education centers, libraries, and industries, may be included, but must be working in partnerships with schools or school districts. When choosing sites, the Institute encourages researchers to consider learning about the important policy choices states and localities may be making, and capturing variations in program practices and operating conditions. For example, some states, like California, Massachusetts, Indiana, South Carolina, and Virginia, have been noted for strong science standards, starting in the early elementary grades. Other states may be developing stronger science instruction in response to next-generation science standards or other initiatives. Such potential research settings would not only be expected to have science instruction in the early grades, but might also offer a greater range of science teaching actions in those grades. Researchers might also consider sites with evidence of strong science achievement among students from low-income communities and groups underrepresented in science professions. Now let's talk about the major sections of your application on which reviewers will base their scores. The narrative must include 5 sections: significance, research plan, leadership and outreach activities, management and institutional resources, and personnel. The significance section is your key opportunity to get reviewers excited about the work that you're about to propose. In the significance section, you provide rationale for your approach for addressing the objectives of the center. You must provide a description of the major issues and research questions that the center will address, the conceptual framework that will guide the center's work, You should provide a review of the literature and describe how your theoretical framework will guide the research design, data collection, and analysis plans described later in the proposal. Your literature review should provide the rationale for the areas of science that your research is going to focus on, and provide justification for this choice. If other content areas, such as reading or math, will be included in the study, explain this choice as well. You should describe the state of the elementary science teaching field, particularly around how to support science interest and learning for the students from low-income families and underrepresented groups in the early elementary grades. You should discuss the factors contributing to achievement gaps in science as students move through the education system. You should discuss the specific learning needs of the students from low-income families and underrepresented groups. Now let's talk about the research plan section of your application. In order to be responsive and sent forward for scientific peer review, applications must include a research plan section that describes the following: the research design for each study. That includes the observational study, the measurement study, and the longitudinal study. Your research must be prospective and include primary data collection for each of the 3 studies, though you may also use some secondary data sources. Each study must focus on students from low-income families and underrepresented groups. Remember that the Institute seeks to fund a center that will integrate literature and methods from multiple disciplines, including those not often used in research on teaching, such as industrial organizational psychology and cognitive science, to help advance teaching theory and practice. Here is where you would describe the methods from the various disciplines that will be used to gain new insights into teaching. I strongly recommend that you read the RFA carefully, including the recommendations for strong application. Recommendations are based on IES experience and reviewers use those recommendations to distinguish between high and low quality applications. For instance, the recommendation to describe how you will take into account different sources of variation in science teaching actions and its link to student outcomes actually comes directly from past reviewer concerns. Now let's talk about the personnel section of your application. In order to be responsive and sent forward for scientific peer review, applications under the Science Teaching Center topic must describe the research team. The purpose of this section is to describe the relevant expertise of each project personnel, the responsibilities of each team member, and each team member's time commitments. Remember that the Institute seeks to fund a center that will integrate literature and methods from multiple disciplines. So here is where you would discuss who brings the expertise from different disciplines to integrate into the research. You also want to make sure you identify who will bring expertise in science teaching and learning in the early elementary grades, research methods, measurement. You want to identify who has experience working with authentic education settings to carry out the proposed projects, and experience carrying out national leadership activities. The following are the requirements for the grant award and must be addressed in your application. The duration of the center must not be more than 5 years. The budget must not be more than $5 million. You must allocate at least 75% of the total budget to the focus program of research. And finally, you must reserve at least 5% of the total budget, and that's $250,000, for supplemental studies. These need not be described in your application. They will be designed after the center is up and running. Let's talk a little bit about the appendices in your proposal submission. Use Appendix A to describe the required response to reviewers. How is the revised application responsive to prior reviews? If you have submitted a somewhat similar application in the past, but are submitting the current application as a new application, you should use Appendix A to provide a rationale explaining why the current application should be considered a new application rather than a resubmitted application. This appendix may be only relevant for the Science Teaching Center, which was competed as a network last year. Use Appendix B to include figures, charts, or tables that supplement the center narrative as well as examples of measures. These include individual items, tests, surveys, observation, and interview protocols that you'll be using to collect data in your project. You may also include a timeline of project activities here. Remember though, do not include narrative text here. In Appendix C, if you're proposing to explore, develop, evaluate, or validate an intervention or assessment, you may want to include examples of those materials, computer screenshots, assessment items, or other materials used in the intervention or assessment to be explored, developed, evaluated, or validated. The difference between Appendix B and Appendix C is that Appendix C contains the measures or materials that may be used in any practices, programs, or policies that you're studying. Again, do not include narrative content here. Include in Appendix D the letters of agreement from partners, such as schools and districts, data sources, such as state agencies holding administrative data, and consultants. Ensure that the letters reproduce well so that the reviewers can easily read them. Do not reduce the font or margins. Letters of agreement should include enough information to make it clear that the author of the letter understands the nature of the commitment of time, space, and resources to the research project that will be required if the application is funded. A common reason for projects to fail is the loss of participating schools and districts. Letters of agreement regarding the provision of data should make it clear that the author of the letter will provide the data described in the application for use in the proposed research and in time to meet the proposed schedule. Appendix E is where you would include your data management plan. You must include a data management plan to be responsive to the RFA. The content of the DMP is discussed starting on page 7 in the RFA under Part 2, Section A5, titled Dissemination. You should consult your resources or our resources on the IES website, which will tell you the key components in your data management plan. Here are the important dates and deadlines. Applications are due September 21, 2017, 4:30 p.m. DC time. Please note that the Institute does not accept late applications. Letters of intent are optional, non-binding, and not used in the scientific peer review of a subsequent application. However, when you submit a letter of intent, one of the Institute's program officers will contact you regarding your proposed research to offer assistance. The Institute also uses the letter of intent to identify expertise needed for the scientific peer review panels and to secure a sufficient number of reviewers to handle the anticipated number of applications. Should you miss the deadline for submitting a letter of intent, you still may submit an application. If you miss the letter of intent deadline, the Institute asks you to inform the relevant program officer of your intention to submit an application. Please see page 59 of the RFA for more information about the letter of intent. After you submit your application, our Standards and Review Office begins the peer review process. Applications are reviewed for compliance and responsiveness to the RFA. Those applications that are compliant and responsive are assigned to a review panel where 2 or 3 panel members conduct a primary review of each application. The most competitive applications move to full panel. After the peer review process is complete and decisions are finalized, applicants will receive email notification that the status of the award and the reviewer summary statement are available via the application notification system. If you are not granted an award the first time, consider resubmitting and talking with your program officer. Here are some tips to strengthen your application. First, we strongly advise applicants to pay very close attention to the recommendations for strong applications. Those recommendations come from IES experience, and reviewers use those recommendations to distinguish between high and low quality applications. So do look through that list of recommendations and incorporate that into your application. I actually tell this to many of my grantees actually. Put yourself in your reviewer's shoes. And the image I like to use is think of someone who, after already putting a full day's work, and has said goodnight to their families, who then begins to read their stack of applications. Or the reviewers who are on a plane, or whatever multitasking case may be, remember it's going to make a big difference how clearly you can get across the information you need to get to the reviewer. It makes such a difference for reviewers when the writing is clear and they find information very easily. So think carefully about when to use diagrams and figures to explain complex ideas. Think carefully about whether or not a diagram or a figure is more effective in getting your message across, rather than putting it into text. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. And certainly you don't want diagrams that then contain such small print that no one can really see what you're trying to communicate. Think about how you're going to organize the text. Think about how you might use headings and subheadings to communicate the key aspects of your proposal. You might consider using the same headings from the RFA, since reviewers likely are used to seeing IES RFAs. Think about when to use bullet points and boldface to underscore key points to catch the eye of the reviewers so that they can find information much more easily. And then finally, we recommend to all our applicants to seek others' input before you submit your proposal. Try to get a strong, full draft done as early as you can so that you have time to then share your draft with a colleague or 2 or 6, especially those who are not involved with your proposal. Those colleagues should be both within and outside of that niche area. You want reviewers that will comb through your application with a real critical eye. You should certainly contact the program officer and bounce ideas off of her or him. Here's the contact information for each of the program officers overseeing topics in this RFA. I strongly encourage you to reach out to them to discuss your proposal ideas and their fit with the RFA. Email is typically the best way to communicate with us, especially during this busy time of year. In any case, we hope you found this webinar helpful, and we wish you good luck in this process.